social media craze, which I've noticed recently, which invites people to put photos on social media, and it has the tagline, how it started and how it's going. So I thought maybe I would start by telling you how I got into this slightly strange at times world of being a royal reporter, because it's one of the questions I get asked more than almost anything else. How did you get into being a royal correspondent? Were you really into the royals? Did you always want to do it? To which I have to be honest and say, no, not at all. Before working at the Sunday Times, I've been at the Sunday Times for 6 years or so now. Before that, I actually worked for the Telegraph for 10 years. And I started off as a trainee, and then I was a general reporter, sort of running around the country doing all sorts of general news stories. And then I took on a specialism in the arts brief. And while I was the arts correspondent for the Sunday Telegraph, our then chief reporter, who also covered the royal brief, which had been very, very quiet, nothing had really happened for years, was leaving to go off and write books. And he said, oh, I think you should throw your hat in the ring for the royal brief. And I sort of snorted at him in horror and said, why would I want to do that? I've got no interest in the royals whatsoever. And I love the arts brief and it keeps me very busy. And he kind of twisted my arm to apply for the job and said, oh, well, with a Telegraph, we can be quite gentle with them and you get to go on some nice overseas tours. And it's very quiet, nothing really happens that much anymore. And I think at the time my editor thought, well, she's kind of the same age as some of the younger royals, so maybe that might be a good idea to get her alongside her. Anyway, I have to say I very reluctantly threw my hat into the ring for it, and then I got the job. And I was promised by my predecessor that this would be a sort of very gentle 3 months handover where he'd introduce me to the royal households and it would all be very easy and I'd get to know everyone. And 2 weeks after agreeing to do the job, William and Kate got engaged. So what had been a very quiet, gentle brief suddenly exploded into this massive royal story, and actually massive national story. So it was a rather large gulp that I had a baptism of fire, because for the 5 or so months leading up to when they got engaged and their wedding, there was this overwhelming thirst from the editors of, wanting story after story after story and every little detail of what that huge wedding of a future king and queen was going to be like. So I really learned on the job, sort of by the skin of my teeth when I started. And believe it or not, that was more than 10 years ago. So I am technically, I suppose, a veteran these days of the royal brief. So what do I do? What does a royal editor do? Do I just follow them around and write about what they do, and where they go? Yes and no. So one of the very important parts of my job is, as a royal editor of a national newspaper, I am part of something called the Royal Rota. What's the Royal Rota? The Royal Rota is a group of national newspaper print and broadcast journalists and photographers. There's probably around 20 of us or so, and we have special access to members of the royal family on engagements. So we cover their engagements, and how it works is, the Prince of Wales or William and Kate or the Queen might be doing 4, 5, 6 to 10 engagements a week. And we're not all there at every single one. So what you'll have is one newspaper reporter, one photographer, one camera crew will cover one engagement, and then we will share the material to our colleagues. So last week, for instance, I found myself going off to London Dairy with William and Kate, because I was the Royal Rota reporter on that, and I had a rather surreal moment with the Duchess of Cambridge and a tarantula called Charlotte. Some of you may have seen some of the pictures of that. But that's how the Royal Rota works. But then the rest of last week I spent working on an exclusive piece, a long read piece for the Sunday Times magazine about another member of the royal family, which I won't give it away, but I hope some of you might enjoy reading that this Sunday when it's published. It's quite a spicy read. So the job can include anything from accompanying, the members of the royal family on engagements to all sorts of far-flung locations, which I'll touch on in a little bit later, and very happy events like royal babies. Of course, it's bread and butter part of the job, and waiting for a royal baby can, see you standing outside the Lindo wing at St Mary's Paddington, willing the Duchess of Cambridge to get a move on, and then feeling very sorry that you feel like that as you're standing outside in a heat wave or in a hailstorm waiting for the latest prince or princess to arrive. And you have things like, the major landmark events like the Jubilees. I covered the Diamond Jubilee in 2012, which was an enormous 4-day celebration, which was quite an extraordinary thing to see, actually, and gave me the first, I think, glimpse in my job of the outpouring of affection I felt very much was not necessarily just for the royal family. I felt it was very specifically for the Queen, which was quite interesting to see. And then, of course, more recently, as Liz touched on, the very sad, but actually unique moment of the Duke of Edinburgh's funeral, and covering that during a pandemic, really not how it was supposed to be done at all, but then how it was adapted. And it was fascinating to see that. And I'll talk again a little bit more about that later on. And all of that I do for my newspaper, for the Sunday Times, but I also do, as Liz mentioned, a fair amount of broadcast work. I do a lot for the BBC. I do a fair bit for some US networks like CBS and ABC. And I've been thinking about it over the weekend, actually, as I was thinking about doing this talk. But what I love is the mixture of both. I love being able to tell a story in print, where you have more space, literally, and more words to tell the story how you want to do it. But I quite love the immediacy as well of broadcast and doing a live broadcast. And it's funny, my friends often say to me, when I'm doing something like the Duke of Edinburgh's funeral and you're there with Huw Edwards in the studio and you know that you're broadcasting to quite a few million people, do I get nervous? I don't. The one thing I find I still have to do is remember not to swear. I'm a terrible swearer. And that was my biggest challenge when I started doing things, covering big major events for the national broadcasters, was remembering that. But actually, Huw always he keeps me under control. So working on a Sunday paper, I started on the Daily Telegraph as a trainee, and now I work on a Sunday, and I've worked on a Sunday for most of my career. And it has its advantages and it has its major challenges. On a daily paper, you are much more writing about the day in, day out of what different members of the royal family do. But on a Sunday newspaper, the great challenge of the job is to week in, week out, you have to come up with exclusive stories. And by that, I mean stories that none of your colleagues, who are also your competitors and your rivals, know about. So the onus is on you on a Sunday to, break news stories, break exclusives, and lead the agenda for the following week. How do I do that? Well, 10 years in to the beat, it really is all about nurturing relationships, getting those stories from people. And bearing in mind, I work for the Sunday Times. We don't pay people for stories. So you're not a tabloid that gets a ring in and can pay someone for a sensational scoop. I get my stories through having nurtured relationships with members of the royal households, the principals themselves, as we call them, and a really wide range of contacts. And at the heart of all of that is trust. And I would say my job is as much about trust as anything else. Because in order to get information through conversations and meetings you have, to produce a front page story or a story that's going to be talked about and change the agenda and is interesting, the people that tell you things have to be able to trust you to do the right thing with that information. And the best way I can describe it, how my job feels week in, week out, is it feels constantly like a diplomatic tightrope walk, because there are many stories that come my way that I know that members of the royal family and the households will never want me to write. But I'm here to do a job and I don't work for them. And so you have a constant judgment call to make weekly between what information do I use now, what do I hold back, what sensational scoop lands in my lap and I actually never run at all for various diplomatic reasons. So you learn, as every year goes by, I think I'm getting better at making those judgment calls, and people then trust you to do the right thing with the information. But at the same time, I often write stories that, let's say, possibly the Prince of Wales or the Duke of Cambridge or the Queen might not want me to write about. And that's just part of the job. And you have to learn to be able to sort of navigate those relationships to be able to still be in this game. So it's a constant push and pull between making those judgment calls, entertaining my readers, and knowing that when you write something that they might not like, you have to be able to justify that it's in the public interest. Another question I get asked all the time is, what are the royals like? You know, what's the Queen like? What's the Duke of Cambridge like? What's Prince Harry like? And I suppose the answer to that question is probably different. Every single royal reporter you ask will probably have a different response to that, based on our own personal relationships with the principals and the work that they do and what we enjoyed covering. And I think quite often when I'm asked that, the way I respond is, they are human beings like us. So yes, we see them on engagements week in, week out, and we travel with them. And they're like us. They have better days than others, and some days they're on top form, and other days you can see they're not quite into it. But unlike us, we can, keep our slippers on and stay under the duvet and do a duvet day. They constantly have to have their game face on because it's such a public-facing role. We travel with them a lot, and sometimes when we're going to destinations that are sort of security sensitive or logistically difficult, we'll travel on the RAF Voyager plane, which when it was first created, it was dubbed Blair Force One because it was Tony Blair's great, plane to travel the world in. But it's used by the Prime Minister or by members of the royal family for tricky tours. And if you're ever on the Voyager with Camilla, the Duchess of Cornwall, she will always come to the back of the plane for a natter and a gossip. And one of the things I sort of love about her is that she enjoys a gossip and a laugh. And whenever she comes to the back of the plane to see us, I always feel like maybe she just wants to come and talk to the normal people rather than the flunkies who are always sort of paying homage. And she's good like that. A couple of years ago, we had Prince William coming to the back of the Voyager for a very different reason. We were in Pakistan. A group of us had gone to Pakistan with William and Kate on what was a really high-profile tour and sort of security very sensitive. And we were based in Islamabad for that week, but we had a day trip of engagements one day to Lahore. And we went to Lahore with them, had a great day of engagements, and then we were due to fly back to Islamabad that night. And about an hour into that trip, and I am not a good flyer, I should preface this story with I'm not a good flyer, the plane, I can only describe it, just started to shudder and shake. And I can only describe it as it felt like we were on a little bit of cotton wool being tossed around in a giant ocean, and there was lightning all around our plane. And basically we had come up against the most enormous storm, and the oxygen masks fell down, the drinks trolleys were abandoned by the RAF crew, because it's the RAF that fly the Voyager, and it was incredibly hairy. And after about 10 minutes of sort of going like that, the pilot came up on the intercom and said, very calm, as you can probably tell, we've encountered an enormous storm. I've tried to fly through it. And he did. He tried to fly through it 2 or 3 times. And he said, there's no way under it. There's no way through it. There's no way around it. We're going back to Lahore. At which point everyone sort of sighed a huge, huge sigh of relief, and back we went to Lahore. And when we landed, most of us were green. William came to the back of the plane and made a joke and said, he was a pilot, of course. Sorry about that, guys. I just thought I'd try my hand in the cockpit. Didn't go so well. Are you all right? And everyone just sort of sighed a huge sigh of relief. And we were also pleased to see, actually, under the bluster, he looked as green as all of us. But that was one of those moments. And then, of course, we were suddenly stranded in Lahore, and we were not supposed to be in Lahore. This had not been factored in by the security teams. Suddenly there was a huge security alert with William and Kate in Lahore. We should have been back in Islamabad. We couldn't even tell our news desk where we were because of the security threat. So we all stayed in a completely random hotel. And the next morning we woke up in our same clothes, no toothbrush, no change of clothes, nothing. Off we went to go and do an impromptu morning of engagements that had been cooked up by the private secretaries. And I was doing that rota with William and Kate, and I thought to myself, God, they look immaculate. And she's wearing a beautiful new dress, and he's in this amazing suit. And of course, their kit had been driven down overnight from Islamabad to Lahore. We were still in our crumpled, terrified clothes from the storm the night before. Anyway, you also, I mean, that was one of those moments where William kind of can turn on the charm. But you also, and I was thinking about talking to you guys today, I realized that I've been in a rather sort of privileged position to see them in some very vulnerable moments throughout this job. And one of them that really springs to mind was during the Diamond Jubilee tour that they did on behalf of the Queen. Lots of members of the royal family went around the world and did tours on behalf of the Queen during the Diamond Jubilee. And I went with William and Kate on a tour to Singapore, Malaysia, Borneo, and then the Solomon Islands. And this tour was going incredibly well. It was a very celebratory tour in feel. It was picture perfect. And then as they were due to leave Malaysia and go on to Borneo, some of you might remember that some very, very compromising personal photographs of the Duchess of Cambridge were published in a French magazine. And they had been taken on a private holiday that William and Kate were on in the south of France by a very long lens paparazzi just before that tour. And in an instant, the whole feel of that tour changed, and it had gone from being, this picture perfect celebratory tour to suddenly feeling really quite tense. And the logistics of that trip meant that pretty much the whole pack, all the reporters and photographers after Malaysia, were going to advance onto the Solomon Islands. But the next 2 days fell to the Sundays. So myself and maybe only 2 other reporters went into the Borneo rainforest with the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge as this huge global story was breaking. And it was, a very distressing time for them, because we were in the eye of the storm with this enormous global news story, with editors, screaming, and shouting and tearing up their hair out, desperate for us to get the scoop from them. But you're also on the ground in the rainforest in Borneo, very conscious that you're with 2 people whose invasion, whose privacy has just been invaded enormously. And all of that evoked for William at the time, harking back to, the paparazzi treatment of Diana, seeing it now repeated with his wife. And it was really quite an extraordinary moment. And you had the feeling of being at the heart of something that was very sensitive, but also under enormous pressure as we were to deliver some enormous front page scoop that weekend for the Sunday papers, which we did actually. And they were incredible, and their team were amazing in sort of briefing us on how they felt very personally and what they were going to do, what legal action they were going to take. But I think that was the first time in the years that I'd been doing that job, and I'd been doing it only for 2.5 years at that point, that I really started to understand the pressures of that public role of being a member of the royal family, where something really quite distressing like that can happen. And yet there is almost no time to stop and reflect and deal with it, because you have to put your game face on. Because although a magazine in France might have published topless photos of the Duchess of Cambridge, you have to go out and meet the next politician, meet the next charity, because these people have spent months waiting to meet you and it's all been planned. And actually, I was thinking much more recently about another moment like that, where in 2019, I was on a tour with Harry and Meghan, their tour of Southern Africa. And during that trip, Prince Harry went on his own to Angola to go and see the extraordinary legacy of some of Diana's work. You might remember that she went out to Angola very shortly before she died, and was raising this issue of landmines and how they had been injuring and maiming a lot of children and people there as a legacy of the war out there. And Harry went to Angola and was photographed and filmed walking down exactly the same spot you remember Diana had walked down just before she died in Angola, through that landmine field. And now it's a very buzzy street. It's thriving, which is testament to the work that Diana started and Harry has continued with. And I was so struck by his calm and his ability to handle his emotions, which he isn't always able to do. We know he can be quite fiery. And I remember very soon after that, on that trip, I asked him, how on earth did you do that? How did you not break down? How did you manage not to cry? walking through that, and which must have just been a very, very emotional moment for him. And his answer to me was, well, I wouldn't be very good at my job after all these years if I broke down in tears in front of the world's media. There's a time to do that, and that's in private. And I mean, that's just sort of stayed with me, particularly when I think about the way things have gone, you know, in the last few years. It's that notion of you being almost never away from the public gaze when you're on duty is quite extraordinary. Another very surreal moment, actually, I should mention, came in my royal career, was on that tour we were with William and Kate in Borneo. And the day before they actually arrived into the Borneo rainforest was a big moment photographically. And there was a photographer, Ken Goff, who was tasked with taking what was going to be the big photo moment of the weekend. William and Kate were going to be hoisted up in harnesses up these huge trees. They were called forest giants in the Borneo rainforest. So they would be able to see sort of over this rainforest canopy. And Ken needed to test the angle. He was going to be on another tree a few meters away. He needed to test photographing them and shooting them. And the guys on the ground at this research center needed to test the harnesses they were going up in. And for one reason or another, I and my colleague, another colleague on another paper, were roped into testing these harnesses. I remember thinking, really? Looking up, thinking it's very high up and I'm not a great one for heights. And I remember stepping into this harness and he was asking what my weight was and trying to coordinate with what the Duchess of Cambridge's height and weight was compared to me. And I said to him, so we are the guinea pigs for these harnesses for William and Kate tomorrow. What happens if the harnesses fail today? And he just shot back, well, at least it's not the future king and queen. And I'm thinking, okay. So that's how we're reviewed sometimes. I mean, another very surreal moment actually was last year, where I went to Davos to the World Economic Forum. The Prince of Wales was there for a few hours before he was going on to the Middle East. And I mean, that was just before, you know, last January, before the world changed imminently. And I remember sitting there with a colleague from CNN. We were both interviewing the Prince of Wales. And it was the most surreal. I mean, Davos and the World Economic Forum is like something I have never seen before, and I never want to see again, actually. But it was extraordinary. There was every world leader, Donald Trump just sort of walking past you, and slightly plump David Cameron walking past you, and you know, spooks from MI6 and John Kerry and Greta Thunberg. It was extraordinary. And it was one of those real pinch me moments where I thought, this job really gets you to the most extraordinary places that you would never get to off your own bat. And the travel is definitely a highlight. Being a royal reporter and going with them on the road on overseas tours, you get to go to some incredible places. And I've been lucky enough to see countries like Bhutan and lots of Africa, Israel, the occupied Palestinian territories, Pakistan I mentioned. And there are pinch me moments, like when we went to India with the Cambridges and the Taj Mahal was cleared out for us for half an hour. So we saw it with no visitors at all, just us, and it was extraordinary. And that's a real highlight of the job, even though you're constantly running for the 5 o'clock in the morning minibus, and even though your stomach is churning when that minibus drives you through an earthquake in India without stopping, or you're on a stomach churning flight in Pakistan. But it's amazing. The travel is amazing, and I'm very grateful for it. And you always pick up you meet some amazing people, and you get to see the world, I think, in a very unique perspective. So what are the highs and lows of my job? Well, I definitely think some of the highs are those moments of very obvious joy, the national celebrations, things like the birth of a royal baby, and of course, royal weddings. And I have now, as I'm a veteran and I'm an old timer, I have covered a fair few of those in my time now. And I'm pleased to say they're all still going. I can remember very vividly William and Kate's wedding. I still felt like a rookie. I still felt very new in the job, and I was. And one of the moments that stands out for me was we were the royal reporters at the time. We were very lucky enough. Most of us were in the Abbey. And I can remember, and that was bizarre, because as you were standing waiting to go in, hours before it started, you know, Elton John wafted past you, or the Beckhams wafted past you, and you thought, this is amazing. But after the service at the Abbey, we were taken in a couple of buses. We were bussed down the Mall, from the Abbey down the Mall, and you can imagine, you might remember the scenes, everything was closed off, and either side of the Mall was just lined with thousands and thousands of well-wishers and people waving their flags and so excited and dying to sort of see William and Kate. And because we were sort of bussed down the Mall that no one else was, I mean, they all assumed we were wedding guests, so they were all sort of waving at us and trying to see who we were, and we were like, it's just us. But we were bussed down the Mall, and we were positioned onto the Queen Victoria Memorial, or QVM as we call it, right in front of the palace for the balcony moment. And I can remember being positioned on QVM and turning around and seeing that moment where all the crowds from the Mall were then released by the police and allowed to sort of surge towards the palace down the Mall. And it was an extraordinary moment. And then being there surrounded by these thousands of people when William and Kate came out onto the balcony with the Queen for, you know, the kiss, or two kisses in the end. And when they did kiss, the roar from the crowd that went up around us on QVM, it was just extraordinary. And I remember the hairs on my arms went up at the time. And it sort of quashed the panic for about 10 seconds of me thinking, what on earth am I going to write for Sunday's paper? Because that wedding was on a Friday. So the Daily's got to write everything that happened on the Saturday. And of course, then the onus is on you. What exclusive thing am I going to get for the weekend? But I was very lucky to have a few insiders at the party in the evening. So I managed to get the scoop on that, much to my relief and the delight of my editor. And actually, you know what? Harry and Meghan's wedding felt the same. That was more recently, and I've been doing it for much longer. And I thought, am I going to be a bit jaded now, doing another royal wedding? But there was something about, I don't know, those of you who might have watched it, that very picture perfect day, it almost felt like a Disney film. It was, Windsor was bathed in sunshine, and there was Harry and William in their very smart blues and royals outfit, and the horses and the pomp and the pageantry. But it felt like this was possibly a new chapter for the royal family, and it was something new and exciting, and you could feel the public goodwill towards the couple, and you could sort of feel this huge sense of excitement, I think, about what was going to come next. And I remember being in the studio with Huw Edwards, and there were some wonderful moments during that day. And one of the great sort of things that I was still learning was when you have these kind of very close up to your mouth mics when you're in those studios that are built, and the studio was built very close to Windsor Castle, and you have to learn to sort of mute yourself. It's a bit like Zoom, but it's almost a bit hairier because they're quite old school, these microphones. And I can remember, I don't know if those of you who watched it, there was a wonderful pastor, Bishop Michael Curry, who gave this incredibly animated and fiery address. And, he invoked everything. And I don't know if you remember some of you, the cameras sort of throughout his talk cut to, Zara Phillips, who was very heavily pregnant, and the Duchess of Cornwall sort of laughing, because, in our world of royal weddings that are always very formal and full of archbishops, no one had ever seen anything like Bishop Michael Curry's 12-minute long, incredible rant about the power of love. And, he invoked Facebook and all sorts of things. And throughout the course of that address, I was with, Huw Edwards in the studio and a colleague of mine from the Mail, Robert Hardman. We were crying with laughter, not at what he was saying, because I thought it was an incredibly powerful speech. But each time the BBC cameras cut to member of the royal family, I mean, they just looked completely bemused. And I think at one point, Camilla and Kate got the giggles, which sort of set us off. And then, Zara looked like she was about to give birth, and the Queen just had her absolute perfect diplomatic game face on. But we were really laughing, and Huw, who was on mute in the studio, was like, what on earth am I going to say about this when we come back on air? And we were just like trying to think of the adjectives he could use. And when Bishop Michael Curry finally stopped, after a while. And even Harry and Meghan looked like they had smiles on their faces. Huw came on air and said, well, that was a very energetic reading from Bishop Michael Curry, and Robert and I just couldn't stop laughing. And there are moments like that that just sort of stay with you, and you remember, and then you remember sort of down the line as that chapter takes different twists, you remember there were these wonderful moments that were very, very sort of happy, memorable times. Another thing I was thinking about actually as a high of this job, and actually it was a very unexpected high, years ago, maybe sort of 6-7 years ago, I remember sitting having lunch with one of William's private secretaries. This was in around 2015, and I was very interested to know, William had got into his groove of, I think, just about balancing family life with, his public life, and that was a real friction for him for a long time, because I think he felt very loath to sacrifice a family life. I think he felt that, perhaps his parents had to do that and his grandparents before him, and he wanted to be able to give his children as normal life as possible. And I remember talking to his private secretary, who said to me, I was like, what is one of the key things he's going to focus on? How will he fill his time, purposefully and with meaning over the next 20, 30, 40 years until he gets the top job? And he said, well, actually, one of the things that he's very, very interested in doing more on is raising the issue of mental health. And I was incredibly struck by that, because we're going back, years now. We were back in 2015, and mental health was not something that really anyone, any high profile figure was talking about. And it's an issue that's very personal to me for personal reasons. And I remember thinking that is fascinating. And I worked with William's team to break that story on our front page in the Sunday Times, that William was going to dedicate, a big chunk of his life to championing the issue of mental health and trying to break down the stigma around it and the taboo around it. And I remember when I was preparing that piece, I spoke to a lot of the charities at the time that were involved in it, that have come to be much better known because, they've been part of a royal campaign. And all of them said to me at the time that if William was going to do this, and of course he did later on with Kate and Harry, it would be a game changer, because no one, they had tried to get high profile or celebrity figures to take part, and no one wanted to, because everyone was so nervous that if they put themselves forward as a figurehead for mental health, that might mean that perhaps they had mental health struggles, and what was the taboo around that, and how that affect their careers. And I remember thinking, what a great sort of opportunity it was, and an honor actually, to be able to do a lot of coverage around that. And it was unexpected. I never thought, coming into the royal brief, that my work would take me down the route of being able to give, what I feel is very positive coverage to an issue like mental health, which I think is incredibly important. And I've been able to do that a lot over the years, whether that's from interviewing Prince Harry, which I have done, several times, and talking about his own mental health struggles, or covering the engagements that William, Kate and Harry have done and their Heads Together campaign. But it's one of the things I feel quite proud of. People often say, what's your biggest scoop? What's the most important scoop? And actually, I don't think you can think of all the excuses you like. For me, being able to do, important work that actually might help people in terms of mental health coverage was really, really important, and an unexpected high of my job. I just mentioned there actually the notion of celebrity, and people often sort of think, I think that, the royals are celebrities. There is something I've come to learn, having been on this job for as long as I have now, about how they're viewed in the world. And I remember when they had just got married in 2011, the very first trip they did as a married couple, and my very first overseas tour, which was with them, was to Canada and California. And it was a long trip. It was, I think, 2 weeks or so, and we spent most of it in Canada, where, of course, you forget, well, I did at the time, that they are the future king and queen of Canada. And they were just revered everywhere we went. They were revered, and there was a real outpouring of affection for them. and a very sort of particular type of kind of respect that you see when you go to these realms. I have to say, I still find it bizarre when you go to big countries like Canada and Australia and New Zealand, that these countries have our Queen as their head of state. And I think, there is a constant conversation around that, and I think possibly a lot of that might change when we no longer have the Queen, God forbid. But anyway, I saw that in Canada, and we got to, at the end of that trip, we did 3 days in California. And we, of course, went to, where else? We went to La La Land, we went to Los Angeles, and one of the first engagements we did there with them was a BAFTA engagement. William is president of BAFTA, and it was in Hollywood, and William and Kate were going to meet, some British people who are working over in America, and all the biggest stars were there. There were Meryl Streep, Nicole Kidman, I think Tom Cruise was there. Every Hollywood A-lister that you can think of turned out for this extraordinary evening. And Kate was wearing a beautiful, beautiful sort of sparkly dress, and it was picture perfect. And I have never seen anything like it. These were the biggest stars, arguably, in the world, the Hollywood stars, and they sort of fell over themselves to try and meet William and Kate. Everyone was trying to shake their hand. Meryl Streep was elbowing Tom Cruise out the way, and Nicole Kidman was sending other actors flying. And that was when I really understood, wow, these are massive Hollywood stars. But the royal family is sort of almost, it's weird. They're kind of, it's above celebrity almost. It's almost sort of bigger than that in a different way, and it has its own kind of stardust. And you only really see it and understand it when you're at an event like that, and you just think, gosh, this is very, very surreal. What are the lows of the job? Well, the lows can be sometimes where you make a decision in terms of what you're going to write, and it's going to land not very favorably, but you have to sort of justify that to yourself because it's going to be interesting for your readers. And sometimes the kickback you get from the households can be difficult. But I think in order to do this job properly, and actually people often say to me, you must be a monarchist, you must love them. And actually I would say that's one of the biggest wrong assumptions about royal reporters. I think in order to do this job properly, and in order to do it well, you can neither be an ardent monarchist nor a staunch Republican. I think you have to be somewhere in the middle. And I think if people sort of ask me, what do you think of them? Well, if I answer that very honestly, I would say there are members of the royal family that I like personally, and there are members of the royal family who do a lot of work that I respect and I think is very good. There are members of the royal family I would happily never see again, who I think, would be much better off without a public role, and whose work I respect less. But I try as best I can not to bring those personal judgments into my work. Although that said, in order to provide interesting coverage for my readers, they want my analysis. So they want to know what I think about certain things, and they want to know, why is Prince Harry writing his memoirs next year important? What does that mean? Why is that interesting? And so they look to you for analysis. And again, it comes back to that constant diplomatic tightrope walk of giving your opinion, but not seeming to sort of fall down on either side of, a divide or a rift. And it's tough, it's tricky. But to go back to what are the lows, I probably, if I'm honest, I probably always thought and always dreaded because of the pressure of it. I think I always thought that a royal death would be a low and would be, incredibly sad, and it was. And the death of the Duke of Edinburgh in April was incredibly sad and moving. But I have to say that actually being able to be at Windsor for that and be part of the coverage, the sort of, the week-long coverage that touched on his legacy, to be at Windsor on that day, to see how the armed forces and the royal family had completely adapted what should have been this enormous spectacle in both London and Windsor to something that was actually incredibly unique and moving and planned by Prince Philip to every last detail, from that Land Rover hearse to, I can remember actually being in the studio with Huw Edwards and watching, I don't know if those of you who watched it, watching his carriage ponies come onto the quadrangle, to watch him on his final journey, which I found very moving. I'm a great horse lover and a passionate rider, and remember Huw asking me, "Tell me what we're seeing here, Roya," and I was choking up thinking, don't ask me now. But it actually wasn't a low, it was a high, if I can sort of say that, because I felt very, very honoured to be a small part of that massive moment in history, and to see how that was done. And I felt very proud to be British, actually, when I was watching, you know, our incredible armed forces give those tributes. It was a really, you know, we are asked to cover the light and shade of this job, and I felt that covering that funeral and the Duke of Edinburgh's death was both. It was light, it was shade, and it was I felt very lucky to see that in such a unique way. So what next? Well, will I pack in another 10 years? I don't know. It's I think for me, I feel, having built up a specialism like this for 10 years, which is sort of unique and takes you to extraordinary places and you get to meet amazing people, I think I feel that, having done the job for as long as I have, and this might sound slightly macabre and I don't mean it to, I feel I want to stay doing this job until change of reign, because I think that will be history the likes of which none of us have ever seen in our lifetime and probably won't see again. And I think it will be interesting for me as a reporter. I think it'll be interesting on so many levels, not just the grand spectacle of it and the pressure of it, but the constitutional impact of it, which, you know, when things get into sort of constitutional issues and politics, it becomes even more interesting for us. So, I mean, touch wood, she looks like she's in amazing shape. I don't predict that happening anytime soon. So, you know, I'll probably be here in another 10 years, giving you a talk in 10 years, talking about what's happened. But what next? Well, we've got the Platinum Jubilee. I can't believe I'm doing my second Jubilee, which does officially make me an old timer. So we're going to be celebrating 70 years of Her Majesty's reign next year. But, you know, which will be, I'm sure, a moment of great national celebration and festivities. But we've got other stuff coming up next year too. We have, I touched on earlier, we have Prince Harry writing his memoirs. So, you know, I have no doubt that that will produce all sorts of reactions and stories and, you know, gossip. And it'll be interesting to see how that goes down. There are challenges ahead for Prince Andrew, no doubt. We will see how the royal family will take the hit of that. And I think that, you know, that's going to probably rumble on for a while. Watch this space, read the Sunday Times magazine for my take on that. But one thing is for sure, there is never, ever a dull moment on the Royal Beat, which I hope you could maybe have got a little tiny bit of insight into from this talk. And it is a bit like a soap opera with extraordinary characters, very surreal moments, plot lines that you literally couldn't predict or could never see coming, twists and turns, but there is never any shortage of drama. But that's probably more than enough for me. I've been banging on and talking for far too long, so I would absolutely love to answer any of your questions. And if we have to go off the record and I'm letting you into a secret, I will tell you it's off the record and not to be repeated. Over to you, Liz.
Well, thank you very much, Roya. That was really interesting. I can't believe the number of countries you must have. Have you counted up how many countries you visited doing it?
I mean, it's so many. I thought, I'm not just going to sit here and list them, but when I say I've probably been to Canada, you know, more than anywhere else in the world. We've been to Canada a lot with them. I mean, I've been to Jordan. I've been all scores of countries, and like I said, many of those I would never have got to off my own back. So no. I love doing that.
Yeah. And I very much envy you being in the Mall. It's one of my ambitions to be in London for one of those big royal occasions.
Well, you must, Liz, you must, because it's an amazing feeling. You must do it.
Yeah, yeah. So Sally Pack's put in the chat, it must be difficult to have a private life.
Me?
For you, yes.
Oh, Sally, do you know what? It's a really busy job, and particularly with the, it's a really interesting question, because I find particularly with the broadcast work, I'm really conscious that people have a set view of me, which is not necessarily me. And it's funny, a few months ago, a great mate of mine said, "Oh, I met this guy the other day who, wanted to ask if he could be introduced to you and thinks you're great, blah, blah." I thought to myself, well, he might think that, but he must only think that from my sort of public persona, either from what I write or from my broadcasting. And you're very conscious of the fact that I'm not on, don't have a public role like them, but the nature of the beast means that you are performing quite a lot of the time, and you do have to put a game face on, and so it is very busy. It's still possible to have a private life, but in my own little small way, it's weird. I suppose I do have a public role. Some people do know who I am through my writing and my TV work and my radio work. So you kind of have to watch what you say even more. But it's possible.
Anne says, "Thank you, Roya. That was so interesting and fascinating. Which royal is your favourite?"
Oh, Anne, that's the question. How can I answer that? Which is my favourite? I'm going to be very diplomatic here, Anne, and say I probably have a few that I get on with William very well. I think one of the things about William, which I actually wrote a long piece on him earlier this year for our magazine, and one of the things that I talked about in the piece was I feel like William, sometimes I feel like the sort of fun and charisma of William doesn't come across you see it on engagements when you're with them, but I don't think it always translates to the public in terms of his public persona, because actually in private, he is very, very funny, very sharp, very charismatic, very cheeky, very indiscreet. He's really fun, actually, and I think William's fun sometimes is lost in translation, and I always slightly feel like I have to kind of justify that to people. So he's a good crack. Harry, God bless Harry. I wish him really well. He, underneath everything that's gone on, there's a good guy there, and he's very charismatic and speaks from the heart. Favorite, I have enormous respect for the Queen, just out of the years and years and years that she's been doing this job, and I think the unbelievable mastery in her art of no one really knowing what she thinks about anything, occasionally letting an occasional little sliver of information come out other than her very close friends and family. I think that's incredible for 70 years in public life. Arguably the most famous woman in the world. I think she's pretty remarkable. Is that diplomatic enough? I hope so.
Anybody else? Anybody wish to raise their hand to ask a question?
Oh, thanks, Anne. Perfect answer. Thank you. Phew. Who are your favourites? That's what I'd like to know. I'd love to turn the tables here, and I'd love to know who some of your favourites are. Am I allowed to ask any questions? Well, Paul.
I don't know whether everyone's seen that. Paul's asked, how about those you can't stand?
Is that a question for me, or is that a question for everyone else?
I think it was for you.
Well, again, that's where that diplomatic tightrope walk comes in, Paul. And through the nature of my job. And, you know, quite often if a big sort of story breaks overnight, or there's a latest development with Prince Andrew's legal case, and I might get called up by the Today programme to come on and talk about it, I'm always very conscious that readers or listeners or viewers are interested in my particular analysis. But they don't, I'm not Piers Morgan. I'm not there to give my opinion on the characters. I'm there to give an opinion on possibly what might happen or how it might impact the royal family or people's perception. But I'm always quite conscious that if you want that kind of coverage, there are the Piers Morgans out there and people who are more opinionated. And I am very opinionated, but I'm also conscious of trying to be as impartial as possible in terms of my analysis.
Very diplomatic answer. Sally Pax put, we met Princess Anne once and she was so impressive and well informed.
The Princess Royal is the unsung hero of the royal family. And actually, when she turned 70 last year, I wrote a feature on her for the Sunday Times. And I loved the headline that the subs came up with, which was Princess Anne, the greatest queen we never had. And I spoke to lots of organisations that she works with for that piece and got some wonderful anecdotes. And one of them I spoke to was RDA, Riding for the Disabled, which I was delighted to do because I'm actually a volunteer and I've been a volunteer for RDA for years. I'm very lucky, not through my job, but I'm a civvy rider for the Household Cavalry here. So I exercise the Household Cavalry horses very, very early in the mornings from Knightsbridge Barracks. And one of my ways of sort of giving back for that great privilege was to start becoming an RDA volunteer. And when I was speaking to the RDA last year, I think it was the chief exec or chairman, he told me some wonderful anecdotes about her. And one of them was just made me laugh so much and just summed her up. She goes to RDA events all the time. And he was saying, you know, the Princess Royal has probably seen the same demonstration by RDA, you know, children and ponies, 100 times or more. And she was at one and they were just starting the demonstration and she was sitting watching, and I think she turned to the chairman to say something to him. And one of the children came by, and I know because I do RDA, the children are all levels of disability, different levels on the spectrum of autism. So you cannot plan it. They say what they say, they do what they do, and out it comes. And one of the children going past her on a pony said, "Oi, Anne, you're not supposed to be talking, you're supposed to be watching me." And there was sort of silence in this indoor menage. And at which point she said, "You're absolutely right. I am terribly sorry. Would you mind starting again? And I will be all yours." And she did. And I loved that.
Wow.
And actually, there was another very funny anecdote that the RDA chairman told me about, which was at another RDA display. She was being introduced to some of the children there. And what the little girl said, because they just do, said, "You don't look anything like a princess." To which Anne shot back, "What a relief. So glad to hear it." I love her. I think she's great and she's very hardworking. What I love about her as well is that she doesn't care about what coverage she gets. She's not in it for the glory herself. She's in it because she's in it to do the work for the charities and organisations that she supports. And I'm really glad, actually. I think in the last couple of years, we have lost 3 members of the royal family from public life unexpectedly, Harry and Meghan and the Duke of York, who stepped back. And I think it's great that the Princess Royal is getting a little bit more coverage. And actually, it's our fault because she's not the sexiest character in the world in terms of coverage. So she doesn't get as much coverage as some of the younger royals. But I think it's really good that she's getting a bit more recognition. She doesn't care about it, but I think it's good that she is getting more recognition for the work that she has done for so long.
Liz Cooper, I loved her on A Question of Sport with Emily Hughes all those years ago. Still cracks me up.
Oh, I don't remember that.
I don't remember that.
Might have been before my time.
It was ages ago.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll have to look it up. I'll have to look it up on YouTube.
It's Emily Hughes. That's predictive
Emily
text
Hughes.
for you. Yeah,
Yes.
Emily Hughes. It was hilarious. She is so funny. I think she's marvellous.
Oh,
Princess
Anne. Good tip.
Yeah, do.
I'm a big fan of Princess Anne as well. We met somebody on holiday a couple of years ago who works in a care home, and she visited the care home in some connection, and she was there for 2 hours longer than she was scheduled to be because she was so interested in what they were talking about. Must be a nightmare to schedule her if she does things like that. Yeah. Do you think the Wessexes are stepping in to fill some of the gap as well?
I think they definitely are. I mean, I think we've seen that, haven't we? They are getting it.
Yeah.
In the way that 2 years ago, Buckingham Palace would not notify us of their engagements, they now do notify us of their engagements, and they want us there as the rota. I really like Sophie. I've met her a couple of times. She's really normal, and I just think she's really, in the last 10, she's kind of come into herself. She's very elegant, and there's just, whenever she's doing an engagement, there is a rapport she has with people that she meets that I think is wonderful. They definitely are, and the Queen loves Sophie and Edward. I think we'll see a lot more from them. I suspect, I wouldn't be surprised if Edward, with his sort of theatrical background, back in the day he worked in film and TV production. I wouldn't be surprised if he takes on Meghan's role as patron of the National Theatre. I suspect they'll probably pick up a few of those patronages. So yes, they definitely are stepping up.
Yeah. Anybody want to wave and make a comment or ask a question? No, a lot of people are hiding. Well, thank you very much, Roya. I could listen to an awful lot more of that, but I'm conscious that we've taken a lot of your time.
Not at all. It's a delight.
I wouldn't call myself a royalist, but I'm always interested in the royal family, and like you, I have the most enormous admiration for the Queen, especially over this last few months, her dignity and in the great loss that she suffered this year.
It's definitely been a challenging year. Well, Liz, I think you must, maybe next year for the Jubilee, maybe finally get yourself on the mount, because she might go on forever, but who knows whether the next Jubilee will be hers.
Well, exactly. Yeah, I actually have an account, because my grandfather was a bank manager was the Westminster Bank in those days, and I can't remember exactly where it was, but they were able to watch the coronation procession from a window of a branch of the bank in London. Wow. And I have his account of that, and that's the closest I've got to actually being there. So, but it's a precious family document, that. So.
I bet. Treasure it.
Yeah. Yes. So, well, thank you very much indeed for a most interesting afternoon.
Oh, thank you.
And we look forward to next time we see you on the television, we'll be able to say we've met her.
Well, I hope next time I see you all, it will be in person. But thank you.
Oh, that would be lovely. Yes.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
It's a real delight.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Oh, that was good, wasn't it? That was brilliant. Yeah. And the thing is, we'd have never been able to have her in person, would we? That was fantastic.
Oh, I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Very good.
Yeah. I hope you all enjoyed it. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. You can just put.